Hey, it's Wendy B, and I am here to help you understand how to create a grant budget. There's a couple of basics. I wanted to answer this question for one of my clients, but I figure that other people would want to know the answer to this too. What if you have a $5,000 grant? They are asking you to comply with a couple of very loose requirements, but it's still a little bit difficult for you to figure out how to put pen to paper to create exactly what it is that they want. So I'm going to go over some of the requirements really quickly, and then we'll go into how do you go about putting together this actual budget that you need to do for the grant application so that they know that you are the best client. What are the requirements? The first requirement that I want to talk about is capital expenditures. This is something that this particular grant has defined within the budget documentation. And it means that typically anything in a federal grant or anything that they're considering a capital expenditure, it has a lifetime of more than a year. And it's over $5,000 per cost or per thing. Now, if you think about it as a piece of equipment, you might consider a photocopier or something that used to be really big. It would be maintaining in your office for a long time. So if you purchase this with grant funds, it would likely outlive the length of the project. In this particular case, they're also including website development in that capital expenditure. Now, it's not only the website development, but also anything that you purchase that has a lifetime of more than 3 years. That might be office furniture or other things like that. Now, the reason that they exclude these capital expenditures from grants and they don't want you to actually use the grant funds for these purposes is because most likely it'll outlive what your project is that you're asking for the grant funding. And it doesn't make any sense for them to completely invest everything in your business if you're going to use it for other purposes, or if you're using it for a nonprofit, if you have other programming that also would use these same exact things, they want to make sure you're spreading these capital investments around to multiple funding sources. First things first, we want to know what can we actually pay for. So in this grant, it looks like it's pretty broad. For the $5,000, they say you can pay for a lot, but they want you to think about what is the cost of the actual project. So let's talk about that first. Typically, we'll have an idea in our head. That's where we start with our vision. That will then go over to a set of activities that we want to complete with this project. Now, we know that those activities cost money in order for us to do them. So our question is always, well, how much money do we need? Now, that is relative to what we're trying to accomplish. So your activities and your money needs to equal your outcomes. So how much money you need for a total project depends upon what you're actually trying to do. If you have a certain set of outcomes that you're trying to reach, that means that this project should be funded enough to reach those outcomes in the duration of time that you've dedicated, right? So this is outcomes over time, right? So we want to make sure that this entire equation is very, very clear in our grant application narrative and in the budget. Because if we don't let them follow this logic as a reviewer and they get lost in this equation, then that means that they might think our project isn't viable or it's not feasible. So we want to make sure that we don't leave any questions about whether our project can be successful or not with the amount of money that they give us. Now, we know for this grant, because it's only $5,000, they want you to think about the project in a very particular way. They assume that your project or your activities, these here, there's a certain set of activities that you're going to do. Now, it might mean that with this 5K, you can only complete part of these activities. You can't complete the entire thing or the entire project, and they know that because 5K is a really low amount of money. So what they're asking you to do is to consider this as money that's part of a larger budget for your project. So that's where you have these other funding sources. And in this budget, they're asking you to describe what are these other funding sources. So how do we know that you've already made some sort of application, inquiry, some way that you are going to get these other funding sources so that we can give you this 5K? So if we give you this 5K and they give you 20 and this other group gives you 10, then you have enough for your entire project, right? But we first have to know, how much is this going to cost us, right? So what are our outcomes and how are we going to get to them? And how much money does it cost us to get to these outcomes, right? And typically we need to scale this by how many people, let's just do it here, number of people served, right? So how many people are we trying to serve? This is the magical part of the equation that we need to know in order to know how much the total thing is going to cost. Now, we know we only need a budget for 5K, and that's totally fine. But if we want to be successful and we want this to be feasible, we need to know how much does it cost me to serve per person, how long am I serving them, and how many times am I going, how many people total am I going to have to serve, right? So this might be 50, it might be 100, and it might be that you start out with 2 and you grow to 50 and you go to 100 in more years, right? That's where the time factor comes into it. So you have to go from your vision to your activities to the budget to the outcomes. But it's not how you should be writing or thinking about this grant. What you should do is say, okay, what is my vision and what is the need? Because this is the part of the equation we haven't entered into yet. What do people actually need? What do these people here that we're going to serve actually need? And if they don't need a certain thing, why are we doing it in our activities? We shouldn't, because we only have 5K plus whatever else we can secure. So where we go from here is to say, okay, we have a vision in our head. We know that people need something. We've probably done a needs assessment to figure that out. So how much money will it take us to serve this many people with this activity set, with these answers, with these solutions, these programs that we've created? How many people are we going to be able to serve? And then we create this larger budget, right? For the amount of time that we're asking for is typically a year if we're working on a grant. So for typically a year of a program, you need to know how much money total this program takes for you to run. Then you subtract the 5K from that. So I know that these are the controls to create our budget. We have a certain number of people that we want to serve. We have a certain number of activities that we want to complete for our entire project. And we know that we have 1 year to do it. So of those activities, we can only fund a portion of them because we know we only have 5K. So from those activities, we need to determine what's in and what's out. Right? So assuming that everything here is what's going to contribute to our outcomes. Everything here is going to help us get to the outcomes that we actually desire. So if we have to do everything here, we need to know what 1, 2, 3 things are in and what 4, 5, 6 things are out. And what do I mean by that? These are what we call line items. Certain line items in your budget support different activities in your project. As you go through the project and you spend money from your budget, you know where to allocate that money to these different line items. So the line items are eventually going to become your expenditures. Now, the line items that you put into this 5K grant might only be helping you get to a portion of what you want to do. And that's totally okay. But what they're asking for is for you to do the entire thing and make sure that you have those other funding sources, right, that you had said you would secure in order for you to be completely successful at getting to your outcomes. So they don't want you to just do a small project. In this grant, what they're saying is that they really actually prefer projects that look like this, that have more than one budget that are feeding into them for their success. Now, it's completely fine for you to do an entire 5K budget. Like if everything that's in that equals 5K, and that's the total of what you're doing, that's it. There are no 4, 5, and 6. In order for you to be successful at reaching your outcome, you only need 5K and you only need to do these 1, 2, 3 things. That is absolutely fine. But what this funder is saying is that's not their priority. Their priority is much more complex projects that have the ability to secure other grant funds or secure other funding streams. So that's why when you're creating your budget, you have to actually think about first, Well, what are the one, two, three things that have to go into this budget? These things become your line items. Now, the next part about that of our 5K is that they tell us that we can take off the top 15% for our indirect cost. Right? So what that means is indirect costs are costs which are not allocable to any other particular line item. They're things that you share, like your telephone service or your internet service or your rental for your space. It might even be the janitorial in your office space. Those are the kinds of things that, as a nonprofit or a business who's applying for a grant, you should always know what your indirect costs are. Now, you might have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with the federal government. If you do, or with your state, that means that you as a vendor have negotiated this rate to be set all the time. And it takes a little bit of documentation to get there. Some organizations don't have that. So if you don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, all you need to do is use 15%. That's what this grantor is saying. The 15% is guaranteed in their grants as the maximum, but they prefer for you to be below 15%. But the first thing that we can do is just say simply that we don't have a rate agreement. So if we don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, then we can just apply the 15% to the 5K. Assuming that $750 is our 15% of our 5K, we're going to go over here to this part of the board. That means we already have $750 that's accounted for. And we'll just say that we need it because we have administrative costs and other things that we need in our indirect cost. So these are our, what we call our IDC, our indirect costs. That's RM automatically out the door off the top, right? So then what we want to do is say the remainder, what we have left is $4,250, right? So if that's the remainder of what we have left for our line items 1, 2, and 3, then we need to think about our cost categories, right? These are the typical cost categories for a grant program. So you'll have salaries, fringe, travel, supplies, contracts, and other. Any state budgets, federal budgets, they're typically broken down into these categories. So what you're trying to do is figure out how much of your activities 1, 2, and 3 are you actually going to be attributing to these different cost categories for this grant. And when you put together the narrative, in this case, they're actually asking just simply for a narrative with a few line items in bulleted form. So when you put them in bulleted form, you're going to use these types of categories to tell them what the costs are. Our time, if you're a solo founder, say for example, and you are someone who is going to be administering the program yourself, which means this is your nonprofit, this is your program, and you are the person who is doing the work. How do you manage your time, right? So obviously your time is going to go into salaries, but there's going to be two different versions of your time. So even though you are the same person, right? So it's the same you. All right, so if you are the one solo founder, in your salaries, you're going to have you as admin. You'll have you as program. But you are the person who is administering the program. So what we could have is a scenario where you simply put for 5K 3 things in the budget. You as admin, you as program. These are number of hours times a rate, right? That's how you calculate that. Number of hours times a rate for you to do the admin work, number of hours times a rate for you to do the program work. Those could even be 2 different rates if you want to pay yourself 2 different salaries, and then or 2 different fees. And then you're going to put your supplies, because usually it'll cost you some sort of supply under $5,000. This is where I talked about capital expenditures. This is not a capital expenditure because those are not allowed. So we are using 5K and under supplies to complete this program, particularly if it's an online program that might be maybe some subscriptions to a web service or something like that, right? So this could be the total of our $5,000 budget. And depending on how much money we want to charge ourselves, our rate and the number of hours that we're charging to this grant. So, think about it. This number of hours can also be split with these other funding streams. So it doesn't mean that we have to charge all of our time to this 5K. We could be splitting it amongst other funding sources. So the number of hours we decide to charge for admin, the number of hours we decide to charge for programming, our rate plus the supplies costs, and you simply subtract that from your 4,250. And that is how you create a very simple budget for some very confusing requirements, including no capital expenditures, 15% or under indirect cost, trying to look for other funding sources so that you could source multiple source multiple funding streams into the same project. And then on top of that, managing the fact that you're probably a solopreneur doing this on your own, applying for the grant funding so that you can actually do the programming that you want to do to serve the people that you want to serve. So we also remember that we had some other controls in this conversation. How many people are we trying to serve? What are their actual needs? And what is the duration of time that we're trying to serve? Or what is the duration of time that we're trying to budget? So for this purpose, it was only 1 year. But if you have a multi-year grant program or a multi-year budget, you might be programming for up to 5 years, right? Or 10 years. So thinking about all of these things, sometimes when you're talking about cost, maybe in year one, we do line items 1, 2, and 3. But in year two, we do 4, 5, and 6, and we don't look for other funding streams. We simply continue doing our work in another way with the same funding stream in multiple years, right? So it's really confusing. Grant budgeting could get so super complex. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but I hope it gives you a real life scenario about how you can create a really quick budget for a grant program that you are looking at that's small, 5K, or has some interesting but open requirements that don't give you a whole lot to work with. This is how you back into the conversation with yourself about what goes in the budget, what do you actually submit, and what doesn't. Because sometimes when we are splitting things across multiple funders, you'll find that some funding streams are a little bit more complex, or they ask you for something with a little bit more restrictions on the money. So you always want to plan for the more restricted money first. So if you're working with funders who are over here and this funder has a ton of restrictions, you're going to create your programming for this funder because that's the most difficult one for you to figure out what to do with that money. If you have a funder like this one with a little bit looser of restrictions, then you're going to figure out the line items that this funder will not allow you to fund. And that's the easiest way for you to blend funding, is to make sure that you're looking for the opportunities to not duplicate. So in this scenario, if we are looking for other funding streams from other funders and we know that we don't have them secured yet, or we're not at the same level as we are with this funder about their application process, then we just simply plan for this funder to actually give us the money. If that seems like a long shot, then what is maybe a better scenario is for us to just figure out what to do with this 5K to bite off a portion of the pie. And then if we have the ability to get this other funder, we can move into further, maybe more numbers, more people. So this is where we might be able to serve 50 people, but with this additional money, we'd be able to do the same thing for 100 people. So really doubling our impact, doubling our numbers by adding that extra funding stream. But that's only if the funding streams are compatible. If they're not compatible and you have to deduplicate what you can actually do with the money, then you have to plan again for the more restrictive funder and making sure that you don't end up sending money back simply because you couldn't use it. So I hope this helps you. Thanks for being here with me on this YouTube, and I really appreciate all the work that you're doing. Please keep it up.